Hi, everyone. My name's James Hilliard. I'm probably best known for writing BIP91, and I've been in the mining industry from the early days, but have been following the development for many years.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro De La Torre. I'm vice president of Poolin.com. We're a mining pool, and I lead the taproot activation effort.
My name is Nick, CEO of Luxor Technology. We're the largest North American mining pool. I've been mining since 2017. Just out here having a great time, great conference. Love to see everybody here. Pavel?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Pavel Moravec. I'm co-founder of Braiins systems. We do a lot of stuff in mining for like the last 8 years, and most famous project we do is Slush pool, which is obviously the most known thing. But the other interesting stuff what we do lately in the last years is firmware for Bitcoin miners, partially open source, partially commercial. Whatever touches software and Bitcoin mining, we tend to have our hands on.
All right. So, as we all know, mining pools are effectively critical to the security of the Bitcoin network because they are the ones who are choosing which transactions end up in a block, and also building on. They also build on top of other mining pool. The blocks of other mining pools, and ultimately, this is what gives the Bitcoin network, its decentralized security, essentially. What would you guys consider the main issues in terms of facing the mining pools today in terms of keeping the Bitcoin network secure and decentralized?
Well, I'll take that first question. I think we have some future and present problems with some pools trying to be compliant. I think that is might hurt, and in my opinion, it will hurt the decentralization and security of the network. So I think right now that's probably one of our strongest problems with decentralization security. Another one is any sort of group or council working together to do something. I think that goes against the ethos of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. So I think that's, in my opinion, what's might be hurting the network in the future.
Right.
And now.
Yeah, certainly. Taking the transactions, putting them into the block, that's a tall task. My concern would mostly be around centralization of mining. Right now we're seeing a large exodus of miners coming out of China into other areas of the world. A lot of it's coming to North America, specifically the US. This is going to be a really interesting transition. It's probably the most interesting time in mining since I've been involved at Luxor. So really interested to see where we go from here, but I think the centralization problem is probably my main concern. Pavel?
I didn't hear the question at all.
I
would love to answer, but it's very, very difficult to hear.
Oh, it was just what do you think the biggest issues today are for mining pools in terms of keeping the network secure and decentralized?
I think one of the very problematic things we can see lately in terms of like centralization security for pools is this notion of national pools. Some governments basically saying, hey guys, you're using our resources in this country, you're going to use our pool because we want to be controlling everything, basically. It is very concerning push towards this very centralized setup, and it is more problematic than some business entity having the same amount of hash rate under the control, because you can expect that miner having a lot of investment put into the mining would behave rationally in terms of keeping the whole thing running healthy, not attacking Bitcoin in the principle itself, because obviously the investment would be like it would be destroyed basically.
Yeah.
But in terms of some state, the incentives can be very different. So yeah, I really don't like the idea of states or governments, local governments, or whoever it could be controlling mining. Because once you force miners to join your pool, you are basically controlling what they are mining, what transactions, and so on. So the whole thing with Taproot, for example, could be very well undermined if decent amount of hash rate is controlled with governments. So yeah, this concerns me probably the most.
So do you think the reason a number of governments have been looking to do national mining pools is so that they can control the transaction selection and essentially, you know, say for instance, like do something along the lines of OFAC compliant block mining? Is that their reason for it, or do you think it's a different motivation?
I think the whole entire new development of national mining pools coming into the industry has more to do with the governments decided they saw a lot of mining taking place in the country. They don't know how to, you know, make some money off of it, so they decided, oh, why they all have to join a pool? Why don't we just make our own pool? I think right now, that's the main reason why they want to do that. But it can just be one more step till it starts becoming malicious. But right now, I think it's just economic incentive.
Yeah, I think government pools are definitely risky for the reason that you had mentioned. Their incentive structure is different. A business is built to make profit, and that's the way the Bitcoin consensus algorithm works. They expect that everybody that's going to be operating there is trying to maximize their profit. But if for some reason you have an incentive outside of making profit, you break the consensus model. So having a government pool where their incentive is to control the money is a lot scarier than a centralized pool trying to do transaction filtering and things like that. Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, there is still a possibility to switch pool. It is not necessarily so easy for every single miner because of possible business relationship with the particular pool, but still, you as a miner has almost always a chance to easily switch a pool. And it is not the case if the government is forcing you to use one particular pool of their creation. So, yeah, it's a completely different thing. And I hope it's not going to spread. We do about like 2-3 countries trying to do it. They are not really technically ready as far as I know. But yeah, it's not a rocket science at the end. And you don't have to be super optimal in the software stack, security, anything, because you're just having the right to force miners to do whatever crap you are building. So,
yeah, I can confirm I've heard of at least 2 or 3 countries considering a national pool as well. So,
okay. So what do you think we as an industry can do to mitigate these sort of risks, for such as the government's potentially running a significant portion of the transaction selection and mining?
I think there's the thing is, if there's a country that wants to create a national mining pool, and let's say you're a miner in that country and you don't want to play by the rules, you don't want to join that pool, I guess you don't have to, right? They won't. I mean, there's no way technically that they can make you, like through code or whatever. But if they try to find out where you are, let's say they start looking at electricity usage in X area, and they found out that there's a spike over here, and there's this facility with no name on it, they can go in with guns and tell you need to join our pool. So it's a very difficult thing to mitigate because essentially the government controls violence, So I do foresee it being a challenge ahead for us.
I think it's relatively small, the risk though, because the rest of the network will continue to operate and mine the blocks that need to be mined. The transactions will get through. Same issue with with OFAC blocks or any of these other types of questionably fungible types of blocks. I think at the end of the day, the blocks will end up getting mined by someone that isn't acting nefariously. So I think the risk there is rather low, but it does exist.
Yeah, but it is at the same time very bad precedence.
Correct.
Once
Yes.
The first national pool or something like it works, then it's a thing to be followed by other governments
Right.
Yeah.
easily. So yeah, obviously you would have to have very large amount of hash rate to actually harm Bitcoin in any measurable way, but still it's not a nice trend. But there is still a technical hope if the governments in the countries are not smart enough, which it doesn't seem to be the case so far. And we as pools and everybody doing work on the technical level in the mining industry, if we will unite about more clever approach to mining in terms of, for example, a mining protocol, what can happen is you can technically run your hash rate against a pool of made by your government, but at the same time control what kind of blocks you're mining. So yeah, it would be a middle ground where they would be happy that they can spy on you, tax your bitcoins and control what you are doing in that particular country. But at the same time, for the Bitcoin itself, it doesn't have to be so problematic in terms of transaction censorship or something like that. But it is a technical challenge. Yeah, it's solvable.
So essentially you're talking about development such as Stratum v2, which can effectively decouple the transaction selection from the pool and allow the farm to still mine to a pool, but still do their own transaction selection. What do you think is currently the major roadblock in the adoption of, say, Stratum v2 or a similar potential replacement mining protocol? Because the existing mining protocol is rather old and has a number of security flaws in it that are very well known. But there's essentially been no manufacturers that have made miners that have really supported this. What do you think can be done to improve the situation?
Well, I think in my opinion, the main reason why this new protocol has been adopted is because there's no real economic urgency. The system, for example, at Poolin, we use the older Stratum version. It's working very well. We're making a lot of money. There's no real urgency to do it. We understand that there's better protocols out there, and we understand that it needs to be updated eventually. But we have a lot of people that work for us. We have a lot of things to do, and it's not very much high in our to-do list. I say if, for example, there is a growth in transaction filtering by Xpool or just Xpool, not Xpool, but or some countries doing something else, then I guess the urgency will increase then.
There is an economic incentive to at the end adopt something like Stratum v2 even for pools which have a lot of other work to do, as you're saying.
Yep.
And it is every single halving, the transactions are more and more important in the block size, in the block value. And currently, it is not very easy to get a full block template out of the Bitcoin client, Bitcoin D, very fast. So the window is few seconds, let's say even in 1 second, and you cannot have fully validated new template for work instantaneously when the previous one is found. It's not currently possible, as far as I know. Let me know if somebody knows about some solution. There is a proposal for Bitcoin D solving this problem so that we would have the infrastructure for having a full template ready for mining of the next block instantaneously when the previous block is found. And it can be even pre-distributed to the miners, so that the expected value from running one hash, computing one hash, through this infrastructure is actually higher. It is slightly higher today, and every single difficulty or
Right.
So
anyway,
it will be stronger and stronger incentive for.
I have a couple things to say on that, but first, like at a tech. So anyway, the miners actually show up with Stratum V1. Like when you go get a mining box, you go to Bitmain or What's Miner, they ship you a miner that has Stratum V1 on it. So that's a pretty big challenge, getting them to upgrade and give you a miner that has any other type of protocol on it, whether it's V2 or Bump or some other protocol that allows for transaction selection. That's a big problem. That's probably one of the largest problems. You can put proxies in front of it. You can do things like that translate V1 to V2, but at the end of the day, until the miners actually support it, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. Getting into what you're talking about, so at the block interval, so when you mine block A, there's like a small interval in there where you mine no transactions. And what you're talking about with your EV is that you would have that next block would be full of transactions, rather than for that small interval you're mining no transactions, aka no fees. And now as the fee becomes a larger portion of the block reward as the halvings increase or continue, the expected value of those shares becomes higher and higher, or more and more dependent upon the transaction fees instead. So there is economic value. Right now it's maybe 18%, but soon it's going to be 36 and then 72, and it's going to become a very big problem shortly. So thanks, Var.
Right. Since today most of the block reward is the
subsidy.
the subsidy versus the transaction fees. Once these these essentially optimizations like validationless mining, SPV mining, it's been once these sorts of optimizations are less useful due to this issue, do you think it will be more difficult or easier for miners to do their own transaction selection separate from the pools? Or do you think there'll be any incentive changes there? Or do you think it's pretty much going to be as it is now, where you need somebody highly technical who's running the pool basically to optimize this process properly?
Well, I think an interesting use case for mining farms to be able to actually add their own transactions is that it represents a new business opportunity for the mining farm. The mining farm is quite large. They can get private customers who want, let's say, priority of their transactions every day or whatever it is. There's a lot of interesting use cases where other businesses can use mining farms to confirm the transactions or whitelist transactions or whatever it is. So that's an interesting business model that will probably come into play soon.
So using mining farms in that way, it makes less sense. I would prefer to see more of a hash rate marketplace come to fruition, where if you have that requirement, you can go and purchase hash rate at spot value. And that'll actually provide a ton of liquidity to the space. And in the future, we think that the liquidity of hash rate will be deeper than the liquidity of order books. And you'll start to see that eventually that it's the easier way to get Bitcoin to mine it rather than go and purchase it on the network.
So the security model of a number of technologies in Bitcoin, such as being used with Bitcoin, such as Lightning Network, and there's some other schemes, essentially rely on the ability to get a transaction confirmed within a particular amount of time in order on the network. So there's been a number of developments in terms of essentially businesses that need to want to pre-purchase essentially guaranteed block space from miners. Now, one of the issues is right now is that essentially only the pools are generally doing the transaction selection, not the actual farm. And in that sense, the pool, if the miners mining to that pool were to switch to a different pool, then that pool might not be able to meet its obligations. How does this these sorts of insurance schemes play into play in here? Should it only be, for instance, those that actually have control over the hardware that should be offering these schemes, or do you think pools that basically rely on third-party miners that could decide just to all switch to a different pool at any time, is that a good idea for those pools to offer? For pools to offer that essentially don't control their own hash power?
That's an interesting
I'm not
question.
sure if I got it.
I mean,
Did you
yeah, I
ask
guess
about-
I guess it makes sense that, I mean, the pool itself does not necessarily, it's not the hash rate of the pool. So I guess the hardware owner should be the more entitled to doing this transaction scheme. Yes.
Or maybe like a partnership with a pool or some.
Yeah.
They'd have to do something along those
Yeah.
lines if they wanted to, I guess, continue not
Correct.
doing the transaction selection. In terms of security, since mining is probably one of the most critical areas in Bitcoin when it comes to security of the network as a whole, because ultimately all confirmations have to be all transaction confirmations are done by mining blocks, essentially. What can pools do to, say, for instance, prevent softer supply chain attacks on, for instance, they're both the pool side, for instance, mining softer stacks, and the miners that mine to them as well?
Pavel?
I don't know. I have serious troubles understanding, but
Well, I mean, look, we actually faced something interesting when we were trying to activate, trying to signal Taproot through our pool. As you guys know, Taproot activation signaling has been going on with mining pools. We're now at 97%, last I checked yesterday, of all mining pool signaling for Taproot. But what we faced was an interesting problem. We found some mining software that miners were using, a percentage of our miners were using, that did not have the ability to signal, which basically halted our ability to signal fully across all our nodes, because if we would just upgrade our nodes to signal, then those machines that were on that firmware would essentially get knocked off our pool. Then we also found some other node softwares. Some mining pools used their own custom node software that didn't allow signal for Taproot in this particular case. So it's interesting that there's a dynamic between pools and mining nodes and software firmware, which actually led to this one particular issue with the Taproot signaling. So I do foresee in the future more of these type of issues. It's a difficult thing to answer what's going to happen in the future, but yeah.
So in terms of the signaling issue, what is I guess the only solution if there's a bug, for instance, in the mining firmware, is to essentially get an update to the mining software on the hardware itself in order to be able to signal. Is that what had to be done, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we did. So we found out which firmware was the one that didn't have this possibility to signal. We actually helped the firmware team to upgrade their code, and then we had to then manually contact all these miners that we knew, because of course there's anonymous miners on our pool as well, but the ones that we knew that were using this machine with this particular firmware, we had to contact through WeChat, Telegram, whatever it is, and they had to upgrade.
Right. So in terms of these sorts of firmware side issues, how big a risk is it that essentially a large portion of the mining software running right now is effectively can only be updated via the manufacturer? Is it bad that we're essentially dependent on the manufacturers to provide updates for issues like this, and maybe potentially security issues as well?
obviously, it's a clear case. Nowadays, it can happen that your manufacturer gives you the new image, and it is signed, digitally signed, and the hardware is unable to accept any firmware than what the vendor provides you. If somebody fucks up and lose the keys, all the miners are fucked up as well. If you want to be sure what you're running on your machine, you cannot because you can, but you have to be very well versed with playing with the hardware, and you can technically get your firmware or almost any machine, but it's not scalable. So for normal miners, it's very difficult to control what the firmware on their machines is running. And there is a long history of not really nice occasions of backdoors in firmware, even from maybe good intentions by the manufacturers. Nobody knows. Probably yes, but it doesn't matter because it's still backdoor. And you as a miner has very limited space for doing anything with it. So in general, we think it's a very bad thing, like a very bad place to be in general. But, some new hardware manufacturer needs to create it and...
So actually, on our pool, we had there was a mining farm that had a firmware bug that it wasn't a bug; it was a malicious attack in which they would every now and then the pool config would change back to some other config which was not mining for the customer. So the person that owned the machine, eventually their rig would not mine for them anymore; it would mine for somebody else. This is a direct result of not being able to verify firmwares easily. It makes it very difficult, and if only a few people know how to get firmwares on and off of a machine, it makes it very difficult for the customer to be able to actually determine what the firmware is running on their device compared to what it should be running. So I think having opening that up, making that more robust is something that the manufacturers need to do, and I think it would be good for the ecosystem, reduce these types of attacks, reduce this this vulnerability that exists in the network.
So essentially, the majority in terms of supply chain security, it seems the biggest issue is on the mining side, the mining firmware running on the actual hardware, since it's a lot easier to mitigate if, for instance, a pool has a compromise, the miners can just switch to a new pool.
Right.
But if their firmware is compromised, they may not have that ability. For instance, like some of the back doors that have been introduced appear to have even been introduced accidentally by the manufacturers, such as the probably most well-known ones, Antbleed. There's actually some ones that were a good bit worse that happened with the same manufacturer prior to that. But nowadays, most of these sorts of errors are a lot more difficult to find because most of these manufacturers have have essentially stopped providing any open source GPL code. For instance, for CGMiner. The CGMiner project, for some background, is GPL v3 licensed, which means in order to comply with the license, all the manufacturer has to do is provide the source code and the ability to for the CGMiner software and to also allow the ability to replace it, essentially, to reload the firmware, basically. How big an issue is it that the manufacturers have basically been going the opposite direction from this intention that the software should be open source, auditable, and replaceable? Is this probably the biggest security issue in mining today, or do you think there's something else that's a higher concern?
Go for it.
Well, look, there exists a whole entire suite of operating systems, firmware for your miners. So if it's not that much of it. Maybe it was an issue in the past. I think it was a more pressing issue. Right now, miners, what I found out with the miners that use Poolin, is that most of them use their own or pay for custom software or build their own software, firmware. So it really has become, there's a whole entire business actually with a firmware going on right now where you can operate your whole entire farm with this particular firmware that might lower the electricity usage of your older machines, might actually overclock, underclock, whatever it is. There's a whole entire business out there. So that actually, I think the markets solved that issue already for us, in my opinion. I think more pressing issues are just a general, push for nonsensical things like ESG stuff. I mean, it's an understandable criticism from mainstream media. But what people need to understand is that mining has actually been on the direction of renewable energies for many years already. And for example, in China, right now it's just the rainy season, and that's all basically more than 75% of the mining that's happening right now in China is in that region, and that region uses hydroelectricity.
Right.
So if you take the estimates that around 60% of the mining in China, it comes from China, and right now 75% of that 60% is green, then that's like, I don't know what the percentage is, but that's a large percentage of the global hash rate from Bitcoin mining is coming from green energy, renewable energy in China. Let's not take into account, that's not taking into account like Iceland, which is 100% geothermal. Canada, North America has a lot of hydroelectric power plants.
Solar, hydroelectric, yeah. That's a great segue. The ESG debate is most likely the most popular debate in mining right now, and I think it's something that we have to address. I mean, there's no way around it. There's going to be $20 trillion worth of ESG money coming into different funds that we need to be aware of. It's not going away, and as long as we're crafting the correct narrative, we can make sure that Bitcoin's on the right side of this. Pavel? ESG, environmental.
It is just unfortunate position we get into. I hope personally that we do see waves of different topics in the Bitcoin environment. Every single year there is some critical topic discussed all over the place. Nowadays it is this thing, hopefully we can overcome it by explaining, and it stops to be the topic because it's going to be like exhausted in like news terms, and then we could hopefully move on to be more productive. So I would hope that it just goes away in a while.
Yeah, like it does every year.
I don't think it's going away. I think it's here to stay. I think this conversation is one we'll be having for a long time, but hopefully Bitcoin isn't at the center of it. Let's try to make that happen.
Yeah, I think because Bitcoin, the hash rate is growing globally, right? We've seen a non-stop growth in the last 5 years. It's just been exponential growth, up in global hash rate. So maybe 2 years, 3 years ago, it was less of an issue because it was just not that big, but now it's getting bigger and bigger. And if you take into effect that some mining from China is leaving China, it's going to North America, to other parts of the globe, that's also going to spread the global mining race. Right. So every single time that they come, I think this time mainstream media was pretty effective in what they looked into. But it's going to every single time it's going to be a little bit more harder because the Bitcoin hash rate continues to grow, and there's more and more participants, more of you using Bitcoin. So that's only going to get more difficult from here.
The Bitcoin energy mix is about to drastically change as well as all of these miners move from the Sichuan province where all of that mining is currently being done. We don't know what the mix of miners is going to be right now because we're not sure where they're going to land. But this is a huge time in mining. Mining is undergoing a massive shift, and it's a great opportunity to try to get into mining.
Yeah, but I don't think it's going to take a long time before this topic will be more or less solved because it can go in two directions. Either it is the case that the incentives are such that miners will end up using resources which are hydro, for example, or things like that. And then the problem is just fat and it's going to go away because it would be depleted. Or there is no solution so that the real problem is really real and then Bitcoin has a problem. But we think that it is mostly fat and it is because of lacking education. Right. And it can be solved. It's just a matter of time.
So get out and tell your friends, Bitcoin is going to save the energy problem. This is definitely something that we're here to do.
It's actually interesting about talking about renewables. I think there's actually a push by some people, some miners, to actually use the intermittent energy from renewables with Bitcoin mining to offset whenever the grid has overcapacity. So let's say you have one solar field and you sell the electricity to the grid. Let's say the grid doesn't need your electricity. You then switch it over to a mining farm, for example. That will then actually generate funds for your solar power, thus increasing the revenue of your farm, which should, in theory, increase the more usage of renewables. So that right there is actually an interesting, very interesting aspect of Bitcoin mining. It can be used to offset whenever, in these type of operations.
So to follow up on this, one of the issues that has been present in terms of being able to better utilize alternative energy sources is that you often need to do heavy customizations to existing on the software side in order to actually be able to optimize the usage of, say, certain renewables and stuff along this line, essentially. And in addition, you mentioned that third-party firmware has the potential, like competition among third-party firmware has the potential to essentially reduce these issues where only manufacturers essentially control the software, but in cases where manufacturers are increasingly adding technical roadblocks for the third-party firmware, which tends to also have the same issue, is that it can't be audited. It's essentially all closed source these days for anything that's actually used in production. How does this, do you see this as a major issue also for being able to better utilize renewables as well?
Well, I think if there's any manufacturer out there that wants to start doing roadblocks and stopping firmware from getting used in their machines, what I say is I think there's already a large amount of people and groups interested in creating their own mining rigs. Right? That will increase the value of yet another manufacturer coming into the play. Let's say I come in with a mining rig and say my mining rig does not stop you from updating your firmware and do whatever the hell you want with your machine. Well, that's good. So I think the market. I mean, there's already a big push for new manufacturers. It's very difficult to create your own mining rig nowadays. There's a whole entire list of very difficult challenges you have ahead of you, like just the chips itself are a roadblock. But I think if a manufacturer plays nasty for a long time, then other manufacturers will step up.
So why do you think this hasn't really changed? I mean, essentially the largest manufacturer has been moving in the opposite direction. Most other manufacturers aren't much better. Why do you think we haven't trended towards more openness in terms of being able to modify the software for our own needs, and in addition to auditing the firmware for security issues? Because, I mean, for instance, there's been instances where essentially a single miner having malware in its firmware has resulted in effectively the destruction of entire mining farms. Essentially due to there's essentially the ability of some mining hardware essentially some mining hardware can be damaged physically by the software itself due to certain features such as e-fuses and even just, for instance, running it beyond operating parameters. Is this just something that most farms aren't technical enough to understand the need for, or is it just that they really don't have another option in terms of vendor choice due to competitive nature of the hardware industry?
I'm uncertain on that exactly. I haven't heard of any farms having that issue, but
Pavel?
Anything?
I don't know the question.
Okay.
But I just heard about farms not being technically very advanced, and it is unfortunately a big true, and it is true for vendors in terms of software and the firmware. If you look at the sources which were published historically, it is not what you would expect from matured industry. It is more like garage software, and it obviously influences the whole system. The security issues related to all this are paramount. We have a lot of historical occasions of like people really stealing hash rate or infecting the miners, infecting the whole farm, destroying the miners because of some kind of virus, and so on and so on. And this is a real issue. New manufacturer would possibly solve it. If any of the current manufacturers would allow other people to build machines from their chips, for example, it would be easily solvable as well.
Yeah.
The rest of the miner is not that complicated. There is a lot of companies who can do really decent miner if they can source chips, which you basically cannot, because you would cut the margin of the vendor, because if somebody can deliver you the whole machine and it can cost $4,000, it's definitely easier and better for them financially than selling chips. But yeah, new manufacturer would solve it. More openness from them would solve it as well. But there is a culture issue historically. The current manufacturers just don't want to do it, and they don't seem to be incentivized enough to open it. Yeah, so my biggest hope would be better openness or more openness in this level or new manufacturer. It would solve a lot of troubles.
All right.
I think that's all the time we have.
I believe our time is up.
We're done, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.